Well, welcome. Let's begin. Good morning. My name is Jeremy Posadas, and I teach religious studies and gender studies on the rural border of Texas and Oklahoma at a liberal arts college called Austin College. And this past spring, I was also the first faculty fellow at the Wendland-Cook program in religion and justice, and I will be moderating today's webinar, which is the next installment in Wendland-Cook's series called Liberating People and the Planet. The series began this past May, and it features authors who are contributing to a volume of the same title, Liberating People and the Planet. And we're very excited to have two of those authors with us today, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. This is one of two webinar series that Wendland-Cook is offering this fall. The other one is called Spirit on the Ground, Stories and Strategies for Faith and Labor. And at the end of today's webinar, I'll have information about the upcoming episodes for both of these series. Just to give a quick overview, in a moment, I'm going to give some opening comments about our theme, Decapitalizing the Means of Thriving. And then I will introduce our two panelists, and we'll have some great conversation with them. We will reserve some time for Q&A at the end. And if you have some questions you'd like us to discuss, you can use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen, and you can pose a question there. If you pose a question in the chat, it would be easiest if you can move it to the Q&A so that all the other attendees can also see it. You have the option to vote up a question that you would like from someone else that you'd like to see discussed during the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But if you all in the audience can vote for questions that you would like us to pay particular attention to, that would be helpful for us when we get to that point. And then at the end of the session, we'll let you know some of our upcoming programming and look towards further conversations. So again, now let me offer just some framing comments for our time today, and then I'll introduce our panelists and we'll get right into our conversation. Here at Wendland-Cook, we define capitalism in terms of power-laden relationships between a tiny sliver of humanity that owns and controls capital and everybody else who must work for them in order to make a living. But let's just pause on that phrase for just a moment. Making a living. The vast majority of humankind must work for owners of capital just in order to survive. Most of us are required to survive on a day-to-day or paycheck-to-paycheck basis. And even if some of us are permitted to plan our life in longer time spans, the fact remains that in order to pay the bills, we must keep working year after year in employment structures that ultimately are controlled by those who own enough wealth that they can pay their bills with their investment portfolios. But all of us who must work to make a living want to do more than just survive. We want to thrive. Yet capitalism is not invested in everyone thriving on an equal basis, because that is incompatible with capitalism's defining goal, the endless expansion for its own sake of wealth owned by the few. The power of capitalism is the power to determine what kinds of bodies and what kinds of communities will be able to thrive, to impose differentials of thriving that ensure the maximization of wealth expanding profits. These differentials of thriving are shaped in the workplace, where the very structure of different jobs creates different workplace safety conditions and health outcomes for those who work primarily at a desk versus for those who work primarily on their feet. These safety and health outcomes are then amplified many times over by unequal access to healthcare. And of course, the coronavirus has heavily exacerbated these divides. Differential power over the workplace then creates differentials of thriving in every other dimension of life, from neighborhoods and schools to transportation and political influence, to access to food no less than access to recreation. In the words of that classic feminist worker motto, bread and roses. And these differentials of thriving are magnified by patterns of discrimination and segregation on the basis of gender and sexuality, race, immigration status, disability, and more. On the global scale, they are magnified by structures of neocolonialism. As I put it in a previous installment of this series, capitalism is the ism that funds all the other isms and keeps them in business. And at the same time, capitalist power also dominates the rest of the ecosphere and sets the terms of its ecological functioning, so that the thriving of a small fraction of one species is secured by the non-thriving of many ecosystems and the downright extinction of thousands of species a year. Thus, in capitalism, the very possibility of thriving from the individual to the planetary scale and from within one species to across whole ecosystems is shaped by being forced into capitalism's circuits of extraction and production. In capitalism, no body, no community, and no species is allowed to thrive except insofar as it actively participates in upholding the expansion of wealth through profit-generating systems of production. To decapitalize the means of thriving, our theme for today, requires that we break this power of capital over all our lives and all of life. And our two panelists today are scholar activists who work to do so in many different ways. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists, and we can move into our conversation. First, let me introduce the Reverend Dr. Gabriella Lettini, who is Dean of Faculty and Aurelia Henry Reinhardt Professor of Theological Ethics and Director of Studies in Public Ministry at the Starr King School for the Ministry, part of the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Arriving at Starr King in August 2005, she was charged with directing the new Master of Arts in Social Change. She also currently serves on the GTU's core doctoral faculty. Welcome, Gabriella. It's so good to have you with us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
We are also joined by Dr. Tim Van Meter, who is an associate professor at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio, where he leads ecology and justice specializations in the MDiv, MAPT, and DMin programs, and helped establish the new Master of Arts in Social Justice. He also serves as the coordinator of ecological initiatives, leading work on food security, community responses to climate change, agroecological theology, and social justice. Recently, he was appointed to the executive committee of the Agroecosystem Management Program at Ohio State University. Tim, welcome as well.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's good to be here.
So in a moment, I'm going to pose a question to our panelists, first to Gabrielle and then to Tim. Let me just remind audience members that if you have a question you'd like us to address in our Q&A period, you can pose it using the Q&A function in Zoom. And anyone in the audience can look at those questions and vote up questions they would especially like to emphasize during our Q&A. But now our tradition that's emerged in this series is to begin by identifying some specific things that people need to be people and the planet need to be liberated from. So now let me ask first to Gabriella and then to Tim, what are some things you would like us to especially pay attention to that people and the planet need to be liberated from?
Well, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel, and thank you for everyone who is participating. Well, as you ask your question, first of all, I think that the separation, the demarcation between human beings and the planet is something that I think needs to be liberated and healed. The anthropocentrism of so much of the European and Euro-American tradition that is embedded in most of Western Christian theologies, I think is at the roots of much of our problems. I think white people in particular, Western culture is shaped by white Christianity, need to be liberated from an understanding of human beings as something apart, different from nature, somehow superior to it, entitled to exploit it, transform it for our benefits, without thinking of the whole, thinking that we as humans somehow know best when we prove that we do not. So we need to be liberated from this egocentric, self-serving, misguided point of view and rethink of ourselves as part of nature, embedded in an interdependent web, part of this living being that is the planet. I also think we need to liberate it from any understanding of a hierarchy of beings, which lead to the justification of relationship of exploitations. And I agree very much with your framing of capitalism that before even being about economics is a system of relationship based on justifying relationship of exploitation. It's a misuse and an abuse of power. So I think therefore we need to be liberated from it. Everyone, humans and all beings, the whole planet. The issue is spiritual and political. They are deeply interwoven. And as you mentioned, capitalism has been thriving on otherism, has been thriving on racism. And the rise of capitalism in the Western world is tied to colonization and slavery. White people as well today is mostly based on this history, and we need to be liberated from white supremacy and settler colonialism. And at the same time, I would also ask movements of struggles to be liberated from paradigms of liberation that justify the oppressions of someone else. That sometimes has been a problem. So we need to be liberated of ways of thinking about liberation that are not intersectional and do not put the voices and the needs of people more traditionally exploited in society at our center, at our discussion and on our work. We need to be liberated from the idea that any beings and any human beings is expendable, which is instead the system of thinking that center capitalism. And we need to put the rights of people traditionally more exploited and marginalized at the center of our struggles. I have a long list, but I think I will continue later.
Well, that's certainly plenty to get us started off there. Yeah. Tim, how about you? What are some of those, either some things that you want to resonate with or some other pieces you want to mention of where we need liberation, both people and the planet?
Well, I resonate strongly with what Gabriella has said. And so in my own imaginative work around this, I spend a lot of time in food and food security and that kind of work, food insecurity. And that came about because of deep concerns about climate and climate change. And I would say that one of the global economic systems and predatory capitalism is at its worst, objectifies all of the other. So everything becomes object except for the holders of capital and of wealth. And the human beings need to be released from even the striving towards that wealth that we find for those of us who are middle class and at other class areas, that begin to reimagine ourselves as creatures in relation, and in relation to all, to other creatures, to the context from kind of a Christian tradition, the context for which we were created, if you want to kind of use that metaphor more strongly. One of the things I'll get around climate and climate change is that folks who aren't quite sure about it in certain contexts, maybe you have that in Texas. We certainly have that in Ohio and other parts. And so the question is, do you like to breathe? Do you like to drink water? Do you like to eat food? And so that kind of work. And with food and food insecurity in particular, I think we need to be liberated from ceding our sovereignty around food to industrial systems. And there's a lot of angst around industrial systems concerning meat. I share that. Recently, some of the inflamed conversation around meat packers, and I'm fully on board with that and their exploitation. But sometimes we forget those who grow our vegetables and pick our vegetables and that kind of labor and how they are also exploited and other elements of it. So I would say that one of the primary ways we can address this is to be in deeper relationship with local small cooperative food systems would be where my work is, as well as thinking more globally. I'll just leave that there.
So you mentioned, if I may, I mean, we both mentioned relationship, and I think one of the core words that's become so important in U.S. culture is instead individualism, and individualism is a way of thinking that kills relationship, that kills communities. And so yes. I think we need to be liberated from this way of thinking that prioritizes the self and of course some particular selves in a hierarchy over the others. Yes. And you know, versus, you know, thinking about relationship and interrelationship and community building and community thriving. And we need to be liberated from an understanding that capitalism is what will make us thrive, because we already addressed and we say probably many times all over today, that is not the truth. Mm-hmm. Also we need to be really liberated from lack of empathy, especially a lot of white people that not only in this country, I see it in Italy as well, this resentment, toxic resentment that a lot of white people have towards other groups that just are trying to address their own survival, their own thriving, their own rights. And so this toxic resentment that sometimes, you know, often leads to scapegoating, as if these other people were the cause of their issues and not capital and not wealth. So you know, how to bring back the focus on relationship of justice, rights relationship, and this deep empathy for each other that leads to solidarity, that leads to equity. Mm-hmm. But it's something that is both deeply spiritual and deeply political, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, this relationship, it reminds me of the, you know, Christian Imagination by Willie James Jennings. I'm sorry for not getting this to Aaron beforehand, and also he has a new book that's just been out for a week. Or Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, that the capitalistic imagination in the West has from the very beginning been built on the exploitation of peoples and enslaving peoples or workers that are never allowed to own their own means of their labor. And that's from the very beginning of what it means to have this kind of capitalist mode. And so objectification of work, objectification of workers, all of those things I think are at the very heart of Christianity and its relationship to capitalism in this country. And it's exported. I mean, Gabriella, you talk about this lack of empathy, that's an intentional strategy by the colonizer, is to make sure that we stay apart. Reading some of the stuff that in West Virginia, some of the early mine strikes where there were the mine owners were most threatened by African-American and poor white folks joining together in a union movement. Mm-hmm. That was more threatening. So they began to sow racial discord in the midst of that continues. You know, it's a strategy from the very beginning to make sure that folks without capital, without the means of thriving, remain turned against each other. And we see that in this election. It's being very strongly promoted in that way through just we can, that's a whole nother conversation.
Oh no, it's an important part of the conversation. And I agree that a lot of it has been engineered and promoted and it's historically traceable. And also I think that there's also the whole element of so much unaddressed, unhealed trauma that comes into play, and you know, and the manipulation of that trauma as well.
One of the things I just want to highlight that's really exciting is the way that for both of you, you're laying out that it's never a choice between addressing capitalism and addressing other isms, but rather always seeing the ways they're interconnected. And it's certainly not a choice of saying which is more important, but rather it's the mutual reinforcement that matters. And we find wherever we can the ways to disrupt those mutually reinforcing cycles. So therefore that means like our fight against racism is a way that we attack the inequality of capitalism. Yeah, go ahead, Gabriella. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No. Yeah, and Tim, when you're bringing, well, both of you brought up the ways that our fight against the degradation of the environment is about breaking the hold of capitalism and the hold of racism. And so I think sometimes the narrative is simplified such that it's a choice, but it's not. And frankly, I think it's a disservice when, I think sometimes mainstream media, certainly political leaders, like to simplify it. But in fact, most people who are in these struggles understand intuitively the interconnectedness of them.
Well, and they live them often in their lives, right? In many cases, so in their own bodies. So
yeah, and I just this our work, white supremacy, and capitalism are intimately tied. And so for those of us who are white folks, the work is internal and external. And maybe that would be true for anyone, but I can speak as a white man. The number of my colleagues who feel under threat when racism is brought up, thankfully that's shifting. And I don't mean colleagues as like internal, but I think just generally within the larger publics, that it's a great experience of freedom to begin to explore the depths of your own racism, mm-hmm. the depths of your own objectification of others. It's a practice of freedom that then gets to be manifest externally too, and it's ongoing forever. And so those connections are deeply tied, and it's also tied to our sense of moral purity in a way that I think is unhelpful in these conversations too. That we're not going to save the planet by ceding to a vegan diet that is industrially based any more than eating meat. That those kind of things are not going to save the planet. We're not going to save the planet by angrily judging our neighbor who drives a car that gets 12 miles to the gallon when our car gets 50. That will not in any way change the structures in which we thrive. And so this kind of I think we have to give up the idea of moral high ground because we are all fully functioning in a system that doesn't allow. And around food, I just want to say one more thing around food and food insecurity. One of the things that gets brought up is, well, people with privilege can afford that. Well, if more people with privilege worked more closely with farmers, all of us could afford that. And so urban food systems and that kind of work that's happening where we are is about the thriving of those who have no access, and feeding people calories that result in their own health and diseases, increased diabetes, health concerns, and all that is not a way to keep people thriving. It's one more way to maintain a system of exploitation. So.
Well, and I wanted to add to what you were saying, that, I mean, again, what you describe in terms of the myth of purity is something that is very typical and of the thinking of white supremacy. White supremacy ideology is something that, of course, it's a falsity. It does not exist in this world, and it's performative, and also it's a deeply individualistic thinking. What we need is deep, systemic, communal change that it's a living in the world, being realistic about where we are and the limitations of what we can do, but still living as if we do believe that it's possible to live in a different way.
Well, and Gabriella, what you just said makes me think about, Wendland-Cook's founder, Jörg Rieger. He's always wants to help encourage us to be thinking more about the role of solidarity, right? I mean, both of you commented on how capitalism and the isms that it sustains are based on others and hierarchies. And solidarity is the negation of that, right? Solidarity says we're no longer going to live with a sense of our whatever group is in an elite role, superiority over others, but rather a sense of we all either thrive together or almost all of us are going to die inequitably, right? I mean, that's the stakes. Solidarity means we only thrive if we're going to thrive together, and we're going to fight for each other's thriving, I think, is part of the solidarity challenge.
Yes, and that the way you frame it is the deep sense of what, solidarity is. I know that is also, it has been used so much as a word that sometimes people think, oh, this is just a really superficial, wishy-washy concept that you can just tell me in solidarity, but you actually won't do about it. But actually what you explain is like this really deeply lived spiritual political practice of being with each other and for the community, which I think is, I'm consider myself lucky because I somehow grew up with that understanding with my faith community, the Waldensian community in Italy, and my families that were all, coming from poverty, that was a way of living. If you didn't do that, you wouldn't survive. If you didn't think about each other, it was instinctual partly, and then become more of a more form political, spiritual thought. But it was, it's not something that came to me from reading books. It's something that came to me from the lived experience of generations of my people in my family.
So I want to pick up on that note, partly because I'm seeing in the Q&A too, there's some interest in hearing more discussion of some, what could this look like? So I wonder if I could just ask each of you, are there some examples you might want to point to of just on the ground stuff that's happening now that to you show us other possibilities? And it can be either from local efforts to broader regional or at whatever scale, but what are just some concrete ways that you see communities starting to make some change happen?
Yeah, well, I see a lot of that in the Bay Area, out of necessity and out of a long tradition of thinking, and out of the need to address reparation of the indigenous people of the land, especially in Berkeley, the Ohlone people. So this, start trying to live not with the myth of being pure and creating a completely different reality, but as if living differently, imperfectly, while imperfectly, can be possible. So I think I see a lot of, alternative housing experiences. It's so expensive to live here that not just people come together, not only out of desperation because they need to share rooms in a house, but a lot of intentional living together, intentional sharing of resources, community gardens. There is the whole experience of, poverty scholarship, poverty organizing, for instance, of Lisa Gray Garcia Tiny in Oakland with Poor Magazine. They build their own housing. These were mostly, formerly homeless people. There are, example of bartering, sharing, childcare, just rethinking in terms of communities and very locally as well. So that, with the understanding that every context is different, it's a different history, combination of people. And so while we might share, some general values, and it's very important to create something that works in that, in that specific context, and try to connect with other groups, but not try to overimpose the same model, because the same model might not exactly what is needed in another context.
I've got a couple of, thank you, Gabrielle. I agree. There's great things happening on the coast. There's also good things happening here in flyover country. Just a super local example, just north of here in a small city named Marion, which is a city with a lot of challenges going on. A local farmer happened to own about a little over a quarter acre of land next to a historically African-American church. He didn't know what he was going to do with it, so he went to the pastor and offered the land to them and just said that, do you want to start a community garden? The pastor got excited. The people in his church got excited. The farmer then brought in his own equipment, removed stumps, plowed it for him, laid down plastic, and they're now in their second year of work there. And it's changed also the community there to where now they know their neighbors. And it's a historically African-American church that it was becoming more and more kind of poor white. And now they're working closely with their neighbors, and they've folks at Ohio State University and their local and urban food program have gotten involved. And There's great things happening around in Mansfield and in Marion and other parts where they're helping folks to have kind of a secondary sub business of being small growers, and then the university will buy from them. That's a movement all throughout Ohio, is to help folks who have just even renters who have just a little bit of space on their that can grow tomatoes and peppers, and the university will buy from them, is a really helpful thing. Then on a larger national scale, the regenerative farming movement, I'm finding a lot of energy with, to where you begin to think about relationships in a way that are with your neighbors, to provide food in a way that, but also to put carbon back in the soil. And there's a professor recently retired from Ohio State University, Ratan Lal, who has spoken at a couple of these conferences that I've been to, that talks about if we move our land into regenerative practices, which are holistic and require some animal inputs as well as some other things for that, but we don't have to in fact, we need to reduce our meat consumption. I'm not advocating for that, but manure is a wonderful enricher in carbon for soils, that we could put back into the soil almost all of the CO2 we've put in the atmosphere since the Second World War. That much. And so that kind of movement on a larger global scale. And one of the myths coming out of an industrial food system is only they feed the world. And that's what it takes to feed the world. Women feed the world. Most of the vegetable farmers in the world are women and smallhold farmers who support their families through that kind of work. And the industrial food system has certain inputs that we're reaching the limits of. Rock phosphate is one of those. And we just don't have the idea that we can continue to strip mine the soil for cheap, empty calories is not a way forward. And it doesn't help for the thriving of anyone. And so the folks on the national level and the regional level at different agricultural institutions and also just local farmers who are just changing their relationship with the soil, to where after growing seasons and after repetitive kind of engagement with the soil, it's not poorer, it's richer because of how you treat that soil. And that's important for the thriving of all of us and for the long-term sustainability of our food system. And also it helps insects thrive. It helps bird populations thrive. It helps, if you just plant a few rows for the deer, you'll help them thrive, and also the predators who need the deer. There's ways to kind of do permaculture and regenerative visioning that helps the land renew itself. And that's a place of hope that I see too.
And I wanted to add that industrial farming also depends so much in grossly underpaid labor and basically new forms of slaveries.
Yes.
So much of the tomato picking in Italy, it's all people of color, immigrants that, especially Black immigrants that live in situation of slavery, basically. And so that's, again, there's that pattern of slavery, racism, and capitalism going together. What? Oh, go ahead. Oh, we don't hear you.
Sorry, thank you. Sorry. There's they're power washing the sidewalk outside my apartment, so I'm trying to.
Of course.
Yeah, right. And I honor the work they're doing. But I want to add to that too, Gabriella, or to both what you and Tim were both saying. There's also the, and there's Tim's dogs. He had warned us they were going to be part of the conversation, so we're glad for their voices. There's also the gender component as well, right? When we think of decapitalizing the means of thriving, we're also talking about undoing capitalism structure where women's bodies, from biological reproduction through protecting families to fighting for communities, are always bearing most of the burden of communities thriving too. And so we've got, the gender piece too, and I think of, and another kind of concrete example, I think of the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, right, founded by the late Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai, which is about land restoration and economic opportunity for women, and also about creating greater democratic equality in the country as a whole. And so models like that address gender inequality, political inequality, economic devastation, those kind of efforts are what decapitalizing the means of thriving are all about. Yeah.
And what I see, I mean, especially when we speak about, you know, gender issue, then the intersectional lens, of course, and seeing how, of course, if we speak about Black women in the United States, or, you know, people of color, indigenous people, women in the United States, then the burdens that have been placed on them are completely disproportionate compared to white women. And some of the work that I see going on that is very interesting in some of these communities is this work that addresses capitalism, but also the justice, trying to decapitalize the work of the activists, because so much of that work in the past has been somehow unconsciously, somehow consciously, somehow because of interiorized oppression, based on paradigms that were oppressive and very capitalistic. Work, 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 deny the body, oppress the body, suffering injustice is always good, independently from who it, you know, whose lives it exploits. And so there is a lot of new work that I found interesting about relearning to, you know, relearning to understand activism and justice struggles from patterns in Earth. Like, and also, you know, relearning the pleasure of activism, you know, not this understanding that it needs to be, I mean, it's related to so much suffering and systemic injustice. And at the same time, there might be ways that are not only always about work and, you know, hyper productivity and punishing the body, not tending to one's health, not tending to the health of other people, because we push people until they drop. And then, you know, we see that in social justice organization at the time, push, 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 people drop out, and you got some new nice young people to push, 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 and deplete. That's a really unhelpful model that needs to be stopped. And so I'm thinking about, you know, the writing of Adrienne Marais Brown in Emergent Strategies and pleasure activism, Sonia Renee Taylor, This Body is Not an Apology. This is all, I think, work that I would suggest to read and, you know, learn from, and that help us to reconsider the way we do justice work and how they have been impacted by capitalism. Another interesting example is the NAP ministry that was funded by Tricia Hersey in 2016, and that see the issues of racial and societal justice in relation to rest, the right to rest, and the right to also, even in community of struggle, of self-care.
Could you, what was the name? I missed the name of that. Could you say that one more time?
Tricia Hersey, Hersey.
And what's the project? Or you said it was a...
It's called NAP Ministry.
Oh, okay.
And it's actually really, you know, I really suggest for people to read it for themselves. It's about especially Black and brown bodies, especially of women, and their right to self-care, and how that self-care and the rest element is revolutionary in itself. And of course, it goes back to, you know, other Lord's tradition. And
so a question that we had already been planning to address, I'm going to pose to you all, but in doing so, I'm going to wrap in some of the themes that have started to come up in the Q&A so we can move towards that. But so the overall question that we had wanted to be thinking about was, where in Christian tradition, what needs to change in Christian traditions in order to move towards this more holistic, solidarity-oriented kind of relationship? And I want to add to that a couple of themes that have been brought up in the questions, both in general, you know, what in Christian tradition needs to change so that, particularly in the US, we can be living this more holistic, equal relational lifestyle. Or maybe you want to address, like, there's a lot in Christianity that's tied to this vision of endless wealth accumulation for some, and the idea that our sense of success in life is tied to that. Another question brought up sort of the issue of purity and the sense of sort of living as pure people. So you can address any of those to the degree that you want to. The overall question was, where do you see some key things in Christian traditions that need to shift to move us towards this other approach? Yeah.
Okay, so, and I have to say, if I'll start and say a few things, then Tim, you come in. I speak as a Waldensian. So if you don't know what that is, you can search it. But so really deeply rooted in my
Reformed tradition in Italy, yeah?
Yeah, no, it's a way pre-reform. It's from a so-called heretical movement in the 12th century that were really anti-hierarchical and really fought an understanding of the church as empire. So one first thing that I would say is that, people need to look at which tradition they belong to within Christianity. And if it's strongly an imperial tradition, then they need to really rethink the whole paradigm, because Christianity as empire is, brings tradition of hierarchy, of exploitation, of oppression, of violence, of scapegoating that do not seem congruent to me with the biblical narratives and what I understand as the gospel. So there have been groups from the beginning of Christianity saying this, and they are still persisting. And so I think that needs to, you can't just be nice within an imperial paradigm of Christianity. It just doesn't work. And within that, then our idea of Christology, that if Christology is not about a man part of a colonized country being persecuted by the state, then it's probably not the real story that these Christians are following. So, of course, that it's complicated how we interpret, scriptures even within Christianity, but I'm really hard pressed to see. I know the history of how the imperial Christianity developed, and people, for instance, here might want to read Saving Paradise by Rebecca Parker, Enrique Tanaka, Shima Brock. There's a lot of literature, but I really show me in the story where Jesus is about white supremacy and accumulation of wealth as a primary human rights of a few. I just don't, I don't see where it's come from. Yeah. So go back to your story and engage critically.
Yeah. Gabriella, I so deeply agree with you. And part of this, Jeremy, I want to say, I'm not sure it's retrievable. I'm not sure that Christianity is retrievable in the West.
You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah. Now I know that people are working deeply for that. I think of the work of John Sobrino and other liberation theologians who really were writing pastoral letters to North America to say, in Principle of Mercy, John Sobrino very clearly says, take my people off your cross to North Americans. And so we have a faith in North America, I will say in US, that is deeply built on the exploitation of others. And so I'm not sure it's retrievable. I think that there are movements within the faith, even folks that will refer to themselves more closely as Christ followers, maybe than Christians, that are trying to do the type of retrieval that Rebecca's talking about. Earlier conversation today with some pastors, there was a letter conversation between Eric Fromm and Thomas Merton in the 60s. And Fromm is known for his necrophilic versus biophilic understandings of human cultures. And these were not orientations of two different sets of people, but really orientations within all of us. And one of the characteristics of necrophilic culture, death-loving culture, is nostalgia, is to look back towards something that we will be great again.
And never was.
Never was. And one of the characteristics of biophilic understandings of the world is being open to evolving to a new way of being, almost open to the mystery and the kingdom of God.
Yes.
In some ways. And that's where Merton was picking. And so that's part of my own. So there has been a fringe, and I think the work that Gabriella referred to of Rita Nakashima Brock's work and Rebecca Parker is one of those texts, but also the liberationists and other folks. There's always a thread, and it always seems to be the theologians and the people at the margins that are maybe bringing in, a socialist critique of capitalism, like Jörg Rieger, others like the liberation folks who are just saying, here's a thread of life. That allows us, a love of life and a love of the possibility of the holy. But it's that thread, it's the margin, it's the fringe folks that have a possibility open. It's the people who have decided to live in community out of Christian values and to have an art of radically different ways of being in the world. It's the folks who decided as farmers, we won't exploit our land or our neighbors who are farmers, but we'll cooperate together and build cooperative structures so that all of us can thrive together. It's food cooperatives. It's the spaces where people are joining together that might offer a thread. But, as affiliated with a denomination who has decided to express its latest vision of colonialism against the bodies and souls of GLBTQ people through the United Methodist Church, there's nothing retrievable there. Doesn't mean there aren't good people in it, but it means that the church, this particular denomination, is determined to define itself over and against the lives and bodies of people who are called to serve out of their beauty for the love of God. And that's not retrievable. And those who have allied themselves with either political party towards kind of a vision of claiming democracy in an undemocratic system, there's nothing retrievable there. And so I don't know. It is a tiny marginal understanding of Christianity that is always pushed outside of power that is thriving. And that might be the space where we can find some hope.
And at the same time, hopefully a lot of the people in these places are able to connect with people from other spiritual, philosophical, religious traditions that same some of the same values and visions. And I think, I see a lot of that in the Bay Area, even in my own school. It's about multi-religious life and learning. It's about building coalitions across diversity, but with a common vision for humanity and the planet. I think that's very important. And within this relationship, we might, especially for us Christian, white Christian, because I see there's a lot of, the different tradition within Christianity, speak about different socioeconomic reality and history. So for instance, I want to name, eco-womanism as one of the thread that is very positive in my view. But going back of like this multi-religious activism and life and learning, I think it would help us organically to regrow a sense of what is sacred that we have somehow lost.
Yeah.
And maybe I hope that it will be somehow contagious, one by one.
I agree, and I've said this. Actually, I said this when I visited a class for Jörg, and I say it in my own classes. It is easier for me to go to a church or to a denominational meeting and say I don't believe in God. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it is easier, and I will be more accepted if I say I don't believe in God than if I say capitalism is a predatory system and we have to change it. And I think that shows the moral and sacred loss. I don't have another word. I want to say all the words aren't quite adequate, but the complete depravity of what we call faith. If we are more wedded to capitalist structures. And I think that's where we are. Because we can't imagine a life where we take better care of our neighbors than we take of ourselves.
I want to switch gears so a little bit. It'll still be resonant, but it's going to be from a different angle. We've had a couple different questions that I think help us think about the connection to the means of thriving, particularly through thinking about food. So we had a question earlier thinking about the role of food insecurity at both pre-industrially And then are there ways that that continues today, that food insecurity, both pre-industrial food insecurity, then creating the roots of our current structures of thriving? And then we had another question about farming that helps us bring some important nuance, and that is, how can we have farm systems and food systems that aren't assuming physical domination of the earth? So I wonder if either of you can talk a little bit about sort of those pieces in terms of food security, farming as a relation to the, or sorry, food insecurity and farming as a relation to the earth. Yeah.
If it's, this is where I thrive. I mean, one of the places that people look back to are indigenous systems that tried to work more closely with the land. And those also have some problematic characters to them, because there are within indigenous food systems an understanding of just kind of moving on when the soil is depleted. But there are within the systems, within more ancient systems, a vision of land where you are in relationship, where the word husbanding or other kind of deep relational understandings come about. I find most hope around the farm systems that understand it to be a holistic relationship where creatures and food are all kind of working together to increase the fertility of the soil. It all comes back to soil. And part of what industrial food systems are doing for us is just, it's kind of extending the arc, I can see my hand, the arc of the human population curve. So in basic biology, we learn about the population curve, that every species expands past the limits of their resources, and then there's a precipitous collapse. And human beings, through their own cleverness, through our own cleverness, have found ways to extend our own population curve to the very, I mean, Jeremy, back to what you said at the opening, to our own detriment and the detriment of the thriving of all species. We have extended our domination over soils and systems to an extent that cuts that out. There's a farm just north of here that I adore. I love the folks that run. It's called Fox Hollow Farm Naturally. And I get some stuff from them because I just think they're doing it right. You walk on that farm on a summer's day and it hums from the life. Just and they're doing animals, they're doing other forms of agriculture, they're doing bees, but it just hums because the life is so there. In the soils, they can mark, they can track the carbon in their soils and other kind of foundations of their soils to where it's building over time because of how they manage the system and how their land there are. And there's farm systems throughout the US and small farmers that are doing that work. That's actually part of my upcoming sabbatical. I want to do more research on how folks are doing this work so well.
And I also think there's a very close connection too between regenerative agriculture and reproductive justice too, right? Because, right, like human life comes both from the soil, but also from the bodies of those who gestate us and carry us into being. And our treatment of the soil and our treatment of reproducing bodies, particularly women's bodies, right? They're very linked together, right? The degradation of the soil and the degradation of women's reproductive freedoms and women's bodies are closely interconnected. There's a whole economy built around degrading both of those sources of life upon which we all depend.
Yes. Yeah, all of us bear in our system the chemicals that have been used to exploit the soil through our industrial farm system. Mm-hmm. All of us have that in our system since the 50s. The human bodies, the chemicals in our bodies have changed, and it affects all of that. So yeah, Gabriella, I've talked a little bit more. I wanted to step out of the way because I know you have things to say about
No, I know that's particularly your focus. So it was very interesting. I wanted to lift up the example of Move and Generation in Auckland. That it's a group that is doing really, I think, important grassroots work also related to food and community farming, and is led by people of color and as you know, and indigenous people. So very interesting group. There are a lot of, you know, we talk about, you know, farming, but there's also importance of urban farming, and, you know, so many interesting examples in the Bay Area, in LA, in Detroit, of people, you know, what do you do when you have been alienated from the land? Then it's try to find every little piece of land, claim it, and see if you can grow something that you can eat without, you know, too much, hopefully it won't be so contaminated that will make it even worse. But yeah, reclaiming the production of food and reclaiming some of the lands in the Bay Areas. There have been so many different struggles to claim lands for the community that wasn't used and just farm it, because if people are starving, it doesn't make any sense not to, you know, and do so in systems that are sustainable. So yeah, a lot of different examples. And also I think for some of, I come from generations of really small farmers, some of which did not possess the land, but they were like working the land, peasants really. You know, see if there are things I learned from that tradition as well. And I see still people living their life. I have friends from where I come from that still just work there in a very sustainable way, the little tiny piece of land up in the mountains. And that's, they don't try to grow bigger, they just try to survive, to make ends meet. And this reality also exists. So the drive to become big and accumulate and, you know, bring food, swap food from different parts of the world, which also it's contribute to so much waste and pollution. That's also a problem.
And yes, and
we're going to have to wrap up, but if you could do this quickly.
Okay. I just also want to highlight one more. Reverend Dr. Heber Brown, who started the Black Church Food Security Network, and that work around there defined that African American and Latinx farmers aren't as welcome or welcomed to the farmers markets. And when they are in the farmers markets, the white folks walk past their stand to buy from a white farmer. That if we could just address that in our consumer behavior in a way, and join with what the work that Heber's doing, which is just remarkable, to try to establish equitable farmers markets within African-American churches that are affiliated with farmers, Black and Latinx farmers in particular, to make sure they have spaces to go. That will help shift the food system too. So I want to hold up the Black Church Food Security Network and others that are doing that kind of work as really important work in this whole area.
Well, I'm so sorry to cut into our conversation, but we'll need to wrap up for our audience members' time. There's just a few things I want to let everybody know as we're wrapping up. We've got some really exciting webinars coming up ahead. October 22nd is the next webinar. It's in the Liberating People and the Planet series, and it will involve Whitney Bauman and Upolu Vai. So we'll have some transcontinental conversation. And then on November 19th, in our Religion and Labor series, the webinar will be Shifting Power, the Working Majority, Transforming Religion and Politics. And that will be after Election Day. Who knows where we'll be in the recount process, or in the count and tabulation process. So it'll be really great to be thinking about religion and labor. Regardless of how the election goes, those are going to be centrally important issues. The links to register for those are in the chat, as well as on the religionandjustice.org website. The Wendland-Cook program has a great blog called Interventions. The current, or the most recent series, had abstracts from what was originally going to be the Liberating People and the Planet conference. And of course, because of the coronavirus, we had to shift plans there, but now we have this wonderful webinar series. And then coming up very soon is, or I think already out, just out, is a series of blog posts on worker cooperatives and religious communities. That's either out or will be out soon. Finally, if you're a audience member, you'll be getting a link to a survey to give us feedback on the webinars. And we'd love just to hear from you. And we look forward to many more great conversations in this important time. A last word of thanks to our panelists, Gabriella and Tim. I've learned so much, I know our audience has. Thank you to you, and thank you to all of our audience members for being part of this conversation. And let's keep finding those small places where we can resist and grow and seed hope for the future together.